A widow chose her strongest slave for her 3 daughters, a decision that sent shockwaves through their small southern town. When Eleanor Blackwood selected Isaiah to protect her children, she shattered every social convention of 1850s Georgia. What began as a desperate measure to save her family would transform into something no one could have predicted, least of all, Eleanor herself. The consequences would not only change their lives forever, but challenge the very foundations of their society. What happened next would leave an entire community speechless. Eleanor Blackwood stood at her husband's grave. 3 daughters huddled beside her as the last mourners departed. The plantation that had once been their pride now threatened to become their prison. James had left them with nothing but crushing debts and whispers that circled like vultures. "The Blackwood girls won't last a month," they said. "Caldwell will take everything before winter." Victor Caldwell, their neighbor whose eyes had always lingered too long on both the Blackwood land and Eleanor's eldest daughter. Now, with James gone, his predatory intentions were barely concealed behind offers of assistance. That night, as her daughters slept, Eleanor made the decision that would change everything. She walked to the slave quarters and knocked on Isaiah's door, the strongest, most intelligent man on her property. A man her husband had both valued and feared. "Isaiah," she whispered, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "I need you to protect my daughters. Not as a slave, but as their guardian." But Eleanor's decision would unleash consequences that no one in their small southern town could have possibly imagined. "I won't accept this arrangement, Mother," Elizabeth hissed, her 17-year-old frame rigid with indignation. "Having him in the house, following us everywhere, it's humiliating." Isaiah stood silently by the door, his face an unreadable mask as the eldest Blackwood daughter's words filled the room. He had accepted Eleanor's proposal not out of loyalty to the family that owned him, but because the alternative, being sold to Caldwell, was unthinkable. "He saved Father's life in the war," Eleanor replied firmly, "and now he'll protect ours, whether you approve or not." The whispers began immediately. Ladies who had once taken tea with Eleanor now crossed the street to avoid her. Men who had done business with James now spoke of the scandal at Willow Creek. A white widow elevating a slave to guardian of her daughters. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday at the general store. Catherine, the middle daughter, stood frozen as 3 young men from prominent families blocked her path. "Your mama's gone crazy," one sneered, stepping closer. "Maybe you need a real man to set things right at Willow Creek." Isaiah appeared as if from nowhere, his presence suddenly filling the narrow aisle. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silent promise of violence in his eyes was enough to make the men retreat, muttering threats as they left. That night, Elizabeth confronted him on the porch. "I don't need your protection," she spat. "No, Miss Elizabeth," Isaiah replied, his first words directly to her since this arrangement began. "But your mother does, and your sisters do, and I made a promise." The protection Isaiah provided came at a price none of them expected, especially when Caldwell decided to make his first devastating move. Victor Caldwell's carriage arrived at Willow Creek precisely at noon, the expensive black lacquer gleaming in the harsh sunlight. 4 perfectly matched thoroughbreds stood in their harnesses, a display of wealth as deliberate as the gold pocket watch he consulted upon stepping down. The crunch of his polished boots on the gravel drive seemed to announce his confidence. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Eleanor watched his approach from behind the faded damask curtains, her fingers unconsciously tracing the worn fabric, a small reminder of how far the Blackwood fortunes had fallen. She smoothed her mourning dress, the black crepe already showing signs of wear after only 3 months. There was no money for new clothes, not even proper mourning attire. "Remember," she whispered to Isaiah, who stood like a shadow near the parlor doorway, "not a word unless directly addressed, but stay within earshot." Isaiah nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. In the weeks since Eleanor had elevated his position, he had become even more inscrutable, watchful, vigilant, but keeping whatever opinions he held locked tightly behind dark, observant eyes. Eleanor received Caldwell in the parlor, where Catherine had hurriedly arranged their remaining silver tea service, a pathetic attempt at maintaining appearances that fooled neither of them. Elizabeth had refused to join them, claiming a headache, though her true ailment was clearly discussed at Caldwell's presence. "Mrs. Blackwood," Caldwell said, bowing slightly but not waiting to be invited before taking James's favorite chair. "You're looking well, despite your circumstances." "Thank you for your concern," Eleanor replied, her voice cool and measured. "To what do we owe this visit?" Caldwell's smile tightened at her directness. A widowed woman was expected to be grateful for male attention, not challenging. "I've come with a proposition," he announced, not bothering with further pleasantries. "The bank has called in your late husband's notes. I'm prepared to assume your debts, all of them, in exchange for your eldest daughter's hand." Eleanor's teacup froze midway to her lips. The proposition hung in the air like a thundercloud. "Elizabeth is 17, Victor." "Old enough to marry," he replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Many girls her age are already mothers. Consider it carefully, Eleanor. Your alternatives are limited." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, conspiratorially. "People talk, you know, about your unusual arrangements here." His eyes flicked briefly toward Isaiah. "The bank is particularly concerned about your ability to manage the property. They've accelerated the payment schedule at my recommendation." "At your recommendation," Eleanor repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. "Business, my dear, nothing personal." His smile suggested otherwise. "You have 1 week to consider my offer. After that, I cannot guarantee the bank's patience." From his position by the door, Isaiah watched the exchange, his presence a silent reminder of Eleanor's unconventional decision. Caldwell barely acknowledged him. Slaves were furniture in his world, not worthy of notice. But Isaiah noticed everything. The way Caldwell's eyes lingered on the silver, assessing its value, the casual way he spoke of taking Elizabeth, as if acquiring a prized mare, the thinly veiled threat beneath his polite veneer. After Caldwell departed, Eleanor collapsed into her chair, the teacup rattling in its saucer. "He orchestrated this," she whispered. "James always said Victor had friends at the bank." "Yes, ma'am," Isaiah replied, his first words since Caldwell's arrival. "Mr. Caldwell has been waiting for this chance since before Master James took ill." Eleanor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "He's been buying up small debts against Willow Creek for years. Merchants, suppliers, anyone who would sell them. I overheard him and Master James arguing about it last summer." Eleanor pressed her fingers to her temples. "James never told me." "He didn't want to worry you, ma'am." The weight of her husband's secret settled alongside her grief, making both heavier. "We need options, Isaiah. Anything but Caldwell." That evening, as a thunderstorm gathered on the horizon, an unexpected visitor arrived. The approaching hoofbeats brought Isaiah to alert, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle hidden behind the hallway cabinet, a weapon Eleanor had insisted he carry despite the dangers an armed slave posed in Georgia. Judge William Montgomery, the county's most respected legal mind, appeared at dusk, his gray hair dampened by the first drops of rain. Eleanor had always considered him an acquaintance at best, certainly not an ally. His wife had been among the first to cut her socially after James's death and her subsequent decision regarding Isaiah. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began once they were seated in the study, his voice low enough that the girls, upstairs preparing for dinner, wouldn't hear. "I've come to offer assistance regarding your, situation." Eleanor tensed, her spine rigid against the chairback. "My situation?" "Your husband's debts and Caldwell's intentions." The judge glanced at Isaiah, who stood vigilant near the window, watching both the room and the approaching storm. I've never approved of Caldwell's methods. The man has ruined 3 families in this county already. The Wilsons, the Harpers, and now he's set his sights on the Millers. Their property conveniently borders his eastern fields, just as yours borders his western expansion. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the room in harsh white light. In that instant, Eleanor saw something unexpected in the judge's eyes. Not condemnation, but something almost like respect. "Why would you help us?" Eleanor asked cautiously. "Your wife made her feelings about me quite clear at church last Sunday." The judge sighed heavily. "Margaret follows the crowd, I'm afraid. A weakness I've learned to live with." He paused, removing his spectacles to clean them methodically with a handkerchief. "But I follow the law and my conscience, Mrs. Blackwood. Sometimes in that order, sometimes not." His gaze drifted to the portrait of James Blackwood that hung above the fireplace, painted when he returned from the war, thinner, graver, but still standing proud. "Your husband saved my son at Antietam, carried him 2 miles to a field hospital with a Confederate bullet in his own shoulder. Thomas would have bled out otherwise." The judge's voice thickened. "I never forgot that debt." He replaced his spectacles, his eyes now focused intently on Eleanor. "And I respect courage, Mrs. Blackwood. What you've done, elevating this man to protect your family, it's unconventional, yes, dangerous, certainly, but also brave." Thunder rumbled, closer now, and the rain began in earnest, drumming against the windows. The judge produced a leather portfolio from his coat. "I've found irregularities in Caldwell's acquisition of the Miller property. Nothing that would stand in court yet, but enough to buy you time, and there may be similar issues with the debts he's collected against Willow Creek." He slid the portfolio across the small table between them. "These are copies of documents my clerk accidentally discovered while reorganizing county records. I've never seen them, of course, and you certainly didn't receive them from me." Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the portfolio. "Judge Montgomery, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he warned, rising to his feet as the grandfather clock in the hall struck 8. "Caldwell has powerful friends, and I'm just one old man with a fading reputation. But perhaps these will give you leverage, enough to negotiate better terms, at least." As the judge departed into the stormy night, Eleanor felt the first flicker of hope since James's death. Isaiah escorted the judge to his carriage holding an umbrella over the older man's head against the downpour. "Take care of them," the judge said quietly, his words nearly lost in the storm. "James spoke highly of you, said you were the most intelligent man he'd ever met, white or black." Isaiah's expression remained carefully neutral. "I gave my word, sir." "Good man." The judge climbed into his carriage, then paused. "A word of caution. Caldwell was seen talking with slave traders from Charleston last week. Be vigilant." Isaiah nodded once, understanding the warning's implications. If Caldwell couldn't control the Blackwood women through marriage or debt, he might attempt to remove their protector by other means. That night, Eleanor stayed up late in James's study, poring over the documents by lamplight, Isaiah standing guard by the door. The house creaked and settled around them as the storm gradually passed. The portfolio contained property records, loan documents, and private correspondence that painted a damning picture of Caldwell's business practices. Not enough to ruin him, perhaps, but certainly enough to cause him trouble if made public. "We have a chance," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to Isaiah. "A small one, but it's something." But that hope would be tested the very next day when 13-year-old Sarah, the youngest Blackwood daughter, disappeared from the property. Her bed was found empty at dawn, her window open despite the previous night's storm, and a muddy boot print on the windowsill that belonged to neither Isaiah nor any member of the household. The fragile alliance formed with Judge Montgomery would now face its first critical test, and Isaiah would need to use every skill he possessed to find Sarah before Caldwell's plan, whatever it might be, could fully unfold. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Catherine's scream shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Willow Creek. The sound cut through the house like a knife, echoing off the high ceilings and wood-paneled walls that had once witnessed happier times. Eleanor bolted upright in bed, her heart seizing before she was even fully awake. For one terrible moment, she thought she was dreaming, the same recurring nightmare that had plagued her since James's death, where she was always too late to save someone she loved. But the second scream that followed was unmistakably real. Eleanor flung aside her bed covers and rushed down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet runner, her nightgown billowing behind her. She reached Sarah's room to find Catherine standing frozen by her sister's empty bed, her face drained of color, one trembling hand pressed against her mouth. "She's gone, Mother," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking. "I came to wake her for chores and—" She gestured helplessly at the empty bed with its rumpled sheets, the impression of Sarah's small body still visible on the mattress. Eleanor moved to the bedside, her hand reaching out to touch the linens. They were cold. Sarah had been gone for hours. Isaiah appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, eyes quickly taking in the scene with a methodical assessment. The rumpled bedcovers pulled back as if someone had slid out, or been pulled. The open window with its white cotton curtains billowing in the morning breeze, and most damning of all, a distinctive muddy boot print on the white painted sill, too large to belong to any of the Blackwood women. "Not her choice," he said quietly, crossing to the window and examining the sill without touching it. His fingers hovered over the print, measuring it against his own hand. The latch was forced from outside. "See here." He pointed to small scratches in the painted wood. Something thin and flat. A knife blade, most likely. Elizabeth appeared behind them, her face pale but composed, her blonde hair hastily pinned up. Unlike Catherine, who wore fear openly, and Eleanor, who fought to control her rising panic, Elizabeth's features had hardened into something resembling carved marble. "Caldwell," she said, the name falling from her lips like a curse. Isaiah nodded, his expression grim. "Possibly, or someone working for him." Eleanor's mind raced through the terrible possibilities. If they reported Sarah missing to the authorities, the sheriff, Caldwell's second cousin by marriage, would control the search. If they claimed she was taken by force, who would believe a white child had been kidnapped with a male slave in the house? The town would assume Isaiah was responsible, giving Caldwell exactly what he wanted. Isaiah hanged and the Blackwood women defenseless. "We have 3 hours before anyone expects to see Sarah in town," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. Years of managing a household through war and hardship had taught her to compartmentalize fear. "We search ourselves first." Isaiah was already moving toward the door. "I'll track from the window. The ground will be soft from last night's rain. Good for prints." He paused, turning back to the Blackwood women with an authority that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "Miss Elizabeth, check if anything of Miss Sarah's is missing. Clothes, a bag, personal items. That will tell us if she packed or was taken with just what she was wearing. Miss Catherine, try to remember if she said anything unusual yesterday. Any hints, any concerns." The authority in his voice made Elizabeth bristle visibly, her jaw tightening. But for once she didn't object. Time was too precious for her pride. "I'll check the stables," Eleanor added. "If a horse is missing—" "No need, ma'am," Isaiah interrupted. "I counted them at first light. All accounted for. Whoever took her came on foot, at least to the house." The fact that Isaiah had already been awake and checking the property before dawn was not lost on Eleanor. The man barely seemed to sleep these days, constantly vigilant. She wondered briefly when he had last truly rested. Within minutes, Isaiah had climbed through the window and was examining the ground below. The women watched as he crouched low, his fingers occasionally touching the earth, his eyes following signs invisible to them. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who had tracked game, and sometimes men, through these woods for years. Eleanor turned away from the window. "Catherine, help me search her room. Elizabeth, check the rest of the house. Any sign of entry or disturbance?" They worked in tense silence, methodically examining Sarah's few possessions. The girl had always been the neatest of the three sisters, her dresses carefully hung, her small collection of books arranged by size on the shelf James had built for her 13th birthday just 3 months before his death. Nothing seemed disturbed except the bed. Isaiah returned through the front door, his expression confirming Eleanor's worst fears before he spoke. Found a clear trail leading from beneath Miss Sarah's window. 2 sets of footprints. One small and light, dragging slightly in places. One large and deep set. A man carrying a struggling child. Catherine made a small wounded sound. They headed for Caldwell's property line. Isaiah continued, his voice carefully neutral. "But it's too obvious. He wants us to think it's him." "Who else would take her?" Catherine asked, clutching Sarah's silver-backed hairbrush. The inventory had confirmed nothing else was missing from the girl's room. Not her warm coat, not the small cloth doll she still kept on her bed despite claiming she was too old for such things, not even her shoes. Wherever Sarah had gone, she'd been taken in her nightgown. Someone Caldwell paid? Eleanor realized, cold anger replacing her initial fear. He's too clever to dirty his own hands. This is about forcing our decision. Isaiah nodded grimly. The tracks head toward Caldwell's land but then turn south toward the river. Whoever took her is making for the trading post at Miller's Crossing. The implications hung heavy in the air. Miller's Crossing was where traders gathered to move merchandise, and sometimes people, downriver toward Savannah and the coast. Once there, a child could disappear onto a ship bound for any port in the world. "He wouldn't dare sell a white child," Elizabeth whispered, horror finally cracking her composed facade. Not even Caldwell would go that far. "No," Isaiah agreed, his dark eyes meeting Eleanor's. "But he could keep her hidden until Mrs. Blackwood agrees to his terms, or until something happens to make you unmarriageable." The unspoken threat made Eleanor's blood run cold. A young woman's value in their society was measured by her purity. If Sarah were to be harmed, or even if rumors suggested impropriety, Elizabeth's prospects would be ruined. No respectable man would marry her, leaving Caldwell as the only option to save the family. "How far ahead are they?" Eleanor asked, forcing herself to think practically. 4 hours, maybe 5. They're moving slow. The man is carrying her weight and trying not to leave an obvious trail. But he's not a skilled woodsman. He's breaking branches, leaving clear boot prints. He's confident, not careful. Overconfident, Elizabeth murmured. He doesn't expect to be followed. Isaiah's eyes flickered to her with something like approval. "Exactly, Miss Elizabeth, which gives us an advantage." Eleanor made her decision. "Isaiah, you track them. Bring her back." She went to James's study and crossed to his desk, removing a small key from around her neck, a key she had worn since the day of his funeral. She unlocked the bottom drawer and reached inside. From beneath a stack of papers, she withdrew her husband's Army Colt revolver, the metal still gleaming from the regular care James had given it even years after the war. "Take this," she said, returning to the foyer where the others waited. Elizabeth gasped. "Mother, if anyone sees him with that—" "Then they won't see him," Eleanor said firmly, pressing the weapon into Isaiah's hands. "Judge Montgomery is our only potential ally with any authority. I'll go to him while you search. Catherine will stay with Elizabeth here." "No," Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice cutting through the room with unexpected force. "I'm going with Isaiah." Everyone stared at her in shock. Elizabeth, who had resisted Isaiah's presence most fiercely, who had refused to even speak directly to him for weeks, now volunteered to track through the wilderness with him. "Elizabeth," Eleanor began, "it's too dangerous. If he finds Sarah alone, they'll say he took her," Elizabeth explained, her voice cold with logic. "If I'm with him, it's different. I know these woods as well as anyone. Father taught me to hunt when the war made game meat necessary, and—" She hesitated, her blue eyes meeting Isaiah's dark ones directly for perhaps the first time. "I can testify to what we find. My word will carry weight that his cannot." Isaiah studied her face, looking for the trap. "It'll be dangerous, Miss Elizabeth. We'll need to move fast, stay hidden. If these men are desperate enough to take your sister, they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who follows. I'm aware." Her chin lifted slightly, a gesture so like her father that Eleanor felt a pang of recognition. "I'm a Blackwood. We don't abandon family." Catherine stepped forward. "Then I should—" "No," Elizabeth and Eleanor said simultaneously. "You stay with Mother," Elizabeth continued more gently. "If this is Caldwell's doing, he'll be watching the house. 2 women alone might draw him out, make him reveal something." Catherine looked unconvinced but nodded reluctantly. "You have until nightfall," Eleanor told Isaiah and Elizabeth. "If you're not back by then, I'm going to the sheriff. Consequences be damned." Within 30 minutes, Isaiah and Elizabeth were prepared to leave. He carried only the pistol, a canteen of water, and a small bag of provisions. Elizabeth had changed into her simplest dress with sturdy boots and her hair tightly braided. She also carried James's old spyglass, a relic from his military days that she had claimed after his death. "Stay to the trees," Eleanor instructed as they prepared to leave through the back of the property, away from the main road. "And, Elizabeth," she gripped her daughter's hand tightly, "trust Isaiah. Your father did, with his life." Elizabeth's expression flickered with something unreadable, but she nodded once before following Isaiah into the dense woods that bordered the eastern edge of Willow Creek. Eleanor and Catherine watched them disappear among the trees, neither speaking the fear that hung between them, that they might never see either of them again. None of them noticed the figure watching from the edge of the property, partially hidden behind the old oak that marked the boundary line. Nor did they see him mount his horse and ride quickly toward town once they'd separated, his urgency suggesting he carried important news. The morning sun climbed higher as Isaiah and Elizabeth followed the trail southward. He moved with quiet efficiency, occasionally kneeling to examine broken twigs or disturbed earth. Elizabeth kept pace surprisingly well, her breathing steady, her eyes alert for any movement in the surrounding woods. "He's getting careless," Isaiah said after nearly an hour of tracking. "See here." He pointed to a clear footprint in a patch of mud. "He's not even trying to hide his trail now." "He thinks he's safe," Elizabeth replied. "How much farther to Miller's Crossing?" 3 hours at this pace, less if we move faster than they did. Elizabeth nodded, adjusting her skirts to step over a fallen log. "Isaiah," she said after a moment, using his name directly for the first time. "Why did you agree to this arrangement? With my mother, after Father died?" He glanced at her, surprise momentarily visible in his usually guarded expression. "Your father asked me to protect his family if anything happened to him. But you're free now. The war ended that. You could have left." Isaiah was silent for several steps, his eyes continuing to scan the path ahead. "Freedom isn't just about going where you want," he finally said. "Sometimes it's about choosing your obligations." Elizabeth digested this as they continued moving through the increasingly dense forest. The land was changing, becoming marshier as they approached the river basin. Cypress trees rose from the boggy ground, their knees breaking the surface of shallow pools where frogs fell silent at their approach. "We're getting close," Isaiah murmured, his pace slowing as he moved more cautiously. "Miller's Crossing is just beyond that rise." They crouched behind a fallen tree, and Elizabeth used the spyglass to survey the collection of rough buildings that made up the trading post. A dozen or so structures clustered near the riverbank. A general store, what looked like a tavern, several warehouses, and smaller cabins scattered around the perimeter. 3 flatboats were moored at the simple dock, and men moved crates between the boats and the largest warehouse. "There," Isaiah whispered, pointing to a small storage shed set apart from the main buildings. Fresh boot prints matching our trail lead directly there. Elizabeth focused the spyglass on the shed. It was a simple structure with one window and a padlocked door. A man sat on a barrel outside, whittling a piece of wood with a large knife, his posture relaxed but his eyes regularly scanning the surroundings. "He's a guard," she whispered. "Do you think Sarah's in there?" Isaiah nodded. "But something's wrong. This was too easy to track. And why station just one man as guard?" As if in answer to his question, Elizabeth spotted movement at the edge of the trading post. 3 men emerged from the tavern, rifles slung over their shoulders. They spoke briefly to the guard who pointed toward the woods, in the general direction where Isaiah and Elizabeth were hiding. "They're expecting us," Elizabeth realized with a chill. "This is a trap." Isaiah's expression darkened. "Not for you. For me." He studied the layout of the trading post, his mind working through possibilities. "They want to catch a slave with a gun, maybe claim I kidnapped both Blackwood daughters. That would solve all of Caldwell's problems at once." "But you're not a slave," Elizabeth protested. "Not anymore." Isaiah gave her a look that contained generations of bitter knowledge. "To men like them, Miss Elizabeth, I'll never be anything else." At Miller's Crossing, 13-year-old Sarah Blackwood lay on a thin pallet in the corner of the darkened storage shed, her head pounding and the taste of laudanum bitter on her tongue. The drug they had forced down her throat when they took her was wearing off, leaving her dizzy and nauseated but increasingly aware of her surroundings. The shed smelled of tobacco, fish oil, and river mud. Through the single dirty window, slivers of sunlight illuminated dust motes dancing in the stale air. Her wrists were bound with rough rope that had already chafed her skin raw, but her ankles were free. They had taken her shoes, perhaps to prevent her from running. Outside, she could hear men arguing about payment and damaged goods. One voice, deeper than the others with the refined accent of education, insisted that she wasn't to be harmed. "Ain't harmed," another voice drawled. "Just sedated for transport. You try moving a struggling girl through 5 miles of woods without someone hearing." "Nevertheless," the educated voice continued, "our employer was explicit. If she's not in perfect condition, your payment will reflect that." Sarah tried to make sense of the conversation through her foggy mind. They were talking about her as if she were a package to be delivered. But delivered where? And to whom? Caldwell was the obvious answer. He had made no secret of his interest in the Blackwood property. But something in the careful way the men spoke suggested they were working for someone else, or at least pretending to. She tested her bonds again, twisting her wrists against the rope. The movement sent fresh pain shooting up her arms, but she thought she felt a slight give in the knots. If she could work at them long enough— Through her fear, one thought sustained her. Isaiah would come. He had promised to protect them, and Sarah, unlike her oldest sister, believed him. She had seen the way he watched over the property, the way he positioned himself to keep all the Blackwood women in his sight when they were in town. Elizabeth might resent his presence, but Sarah had found comfort in it. What she couldn't know was that the men holding her were expecting Isaiah, too, and they had prepared a reception designed to ensure he never returned to Willow Creek alive. The rifle-carrying men were spreading out now, taking positions around the perimeter of the trading post, their eyes fixed on the tree line. Back in the woods, Isaiah and Elizabeth were formulating a plan. The odds were heavily against them. At least 5 armed men that they could see, potentially more inside the buildings, and Sarah held captive in a locked shed. "We need a distraction," Isaiah murmured, his eyes never leaving the trading post. "Something to draw them away from the shed." Elizabeth surveyed the scene through the spyglass again. "The flat boats," she said suddenly. "If one were to break free from its moorings." Isaiah nodded slowly, a plan taking shape. "I can swim downriver, approach from the waterside where they're not watching, but I'll need you to create the distraction." "Tell me what to do." Elizabeth said, and for the first time since Isaiah had known her, there was no challenge in her voice, only determination. As they whispered their plan, the sun climbed toward its zenith. In town, Eleanor Blackwood was arriving at Judge Montgomery's home, her heart in her throat but her spine straight with resolve. And in his mansion, overlooking his vast property, Victor Caldwell received a visitor, the man who had been watching Willow Creek, now delivering news that made Caldwell's thin lips curve into a satisfied smile. "So, the slave and the eldest girl are tracking toward Miller's Crossing?" Caldwell mused, pouring himself a generous glass of brandy, though it was not yet noon. "How? Predictable?" "Yes, sir," the man confirmed. "Just like you said they would." Caldwell swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "And Mrs. Blackwood?" "Headed to Judge Montgomery's when I left." "Excellent." Caldwell raised his glass in a mock toast. By nightfall, the Blackwood women will understand exactly how limited their options truly are. What Caldwell couldn't anticipate was that Elizabeth Blackwood, raised by a father who believed in educating his daughters and a mother who had survived the privations of war, was far more resourceful than the decorative society girl he imagined her to be. And Isaiah, who had spent his life watching and learning while remaining invisible to those who owned him, had developed a keen understanding of how men like Caldwell thought and where their blind spots lay. As the midday heat settled over Miller's Crossing, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the future of Willow Creek itself. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on Miller's Crossing, transforming the trading post into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Inside the storage shed, Sarah worked methodically at her bonds, ignoring the pain as the rough rope scraped her wrists raw. The laudanum had mostly worn off, leaving her mind clear but her mouth desert dry. Outside, the guard shifted on his barrel, wiping sweat from his brow with a dirty handkerchief. The other men had positioned themselves at strategic points around the clearing, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. They were waiting, and their patience was wearing thin. Half a mile downriver, Isaiah slid silently into the water. The muddy current was strong but not unmanageable for a man who had spent his childhood swimming these same waters. Elizabeth watched from their hiding place, counting silently to 300 as they'd agreed. 5 minutes for Isaiah to get into position before she created the distraction. 4 minutes, she whispered to herself, adjusting the spyglass to keep watch on the shed where Sarah was held. The guard had stood up, stretching his back before resuming his seat. No sign that he suspected anything. Meanwhile, in town, Eleanor Blackwood sat rigidly in Judge Montgomery's study, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Kidnapping," the judge repeated, his bushy eyebrows drawn together in concern. "You're certain?" "Sarah would never leave willingly, especially not in her nightgown," Eleanor replied, and the boot print on the windowsill was unmistakable. The judge paced behind his desk. "This complicates matters considerably. If Caldwell is behind this, and I have little doubt he is, he's escalated from financial manipulation to outright criminality." "Can you help us?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "Not officially. Not yet." The judge sighed heavily. "Without evidence connecting Caldwell to the kidnapping, my hands are tied. The sheriff won't move against him on my word alone." "Then what do we do?" The judge's expression hardened. "We create leverage." He pulled a sheet of paper from his desk. "This is a writ freezing all transactions on the Blackwood property, based on the irregularities I found in Caldwell's debt acquisitions. It won't hold forever, but it buys you time." "And Sarah?" "If your man Isaiah finds her, bring her directly to me. I'll take her statement myself." He hesitated. "But Eleanor, if Caldwell has gone this far, he's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." Back at Miller's Crossing, Elizabeth's count reached 300. It was time. She removed a small flint from her pocket, one of her father's hunting tools that she'd kept after his death. Carefully, she struck it against a rock, sending sparks onto the dry tinder she'd gathered. Within moments, a small flame blossomed. She fed the fire quickly with larger sticks, then backed away as it began to spread through the underbrush. The summer had been dry, and the forest floor caught eagerly. Smoke billowed upward, visible, from the trading post. "Fire!" someone shouted. "Fire on the south ridge!" The reaction was immediate. 3 men ran toward the growing blaze, leaving only the guard at the shed and 1 watchman at the perimeter. Elizabeth circled through the woods, approaching the trading post from the east, while all eyes were on the southern fire. At the riverbank, Isaiah emerged from the water behind the flatboats. He moved silently along the dock, keeping low. The remaining watchman was focused on the fire, his back to the river. Isaiah slipped past him, making his way toward the shed where Sarah was held. Inside, Sarah froze as she heard the commotion. Through the small window she could see smoke rising from the forest. Was this her chance? The guard outside stood up, his attention divided between his post and the growing fire. Sarah redoubled her efforts on the ropes, feeling them finally begin to loosen. Isaiah reached the back of the shed undetected. The wooden planks were weathered and warped, leaving small gaps. Through one, he could see Sarah working at her bonds, her small face set in determination. He tapped softly on the wall. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Sarah's head jerked up. It was an old signal, one Isaiah had taught all the Blackwood girls years ago when they played hide-and-seek in the barn. She scooted closer to the wall, her voice barely audible. "Isaiah?" "Yes, Miss Sarah. Are you hurt?" "No. Drugged me. Still dizzy. I'm going to get you out. Stay ready." The guard was now standing at the corner of the shed, his attention fully on the fire that was spreading faster than expected. The men who had run to fight it were shouting for more help. Elizabeth had reached the edge of the clearing. From her position she could see Isaiah behind the shed and the distracted guard. She needed to draw him further away. Picking up a stone, she threw it hard against the side of the nearest building, then quickly moved to a new position. The guard turned toward the sound. "Who's there?" he called, taking several steps away from the shed. Isaiah seized the moment. Using James Blackwood's knife, he pried loose a rotted board at the back of the shed. The opening was small, too small for him, but just large enough for a slender 13-year-old girl. "Sarah," he whispered urgently. "Come here, quickly." Sarah scrambled toward the opening, her partially freed hands still bound in front of her. Isaiah reached through the gap, using the knife to cut through the remaining rope. "Can you fit through?" he asked. Sarah nodded, already turning to squeeze her narrow shoulders through the opening. It was tight, and splinters tore at her nightgown, but she pushed forward with desperate determination. Isaiah gripped her arms, helping to pull her through. Just as Sarah's feet cleared the opening, a shout went up from across the clearing. "The girl! They're taking the girl!" The guard spun around, his eyes widening as he saw the empty shed. He raised his rifle just as Isaiah pulled Sarah to her feet. "Run!" Isaiah commanded, pushing Sarah toward the riverbank. "Your sister is in the woods to the east. Go!" A shot cracked through the air, splintering wood inches from Isaiah's head. He drew James Blackwood's revolver and fired back, not aiming to hit but to force the guard to take cover. Sarah ran as directed, her bare feet finding painful purchase on the rocky ground. From the tree line, Elizabeth spotted her sister and rushed forward to meet her. "Elizabeth!" Sarah cried, throwing herself into her sister's arms. "Quiet," Elizabeth whispered fiercely, pulling Sarah deeper into the forest. "We need to move." Behind them, more shots rang out. The men fighting the fire had realized the blaze was a diversion and were returning to the trading post. Isaiah was now caught in the open, exchanging fire with the guard while trying to make his way to the woods. "Isaiah," Sarah gasped, trying to turn back. "They'll kill him." "He told us to run," Elizabeth said grimly, though her eyes betrayed her own conflict. "We need to get you safe." A final shot echoed across the clearing, followed by a heavy silence. The sisters froze, straining to hear any sign of what had happened. Then came the sound of running footsteps approaching through the undergrowth. Elizabeth pushed Sarah behind her, picking up a heavy branch as a makeshift weapon. She raised it as the footsteps grew closer, only to lower it in relief when Isaiah emerged from the trees, blood streaming from a graze on his arm but otherwise intact. "They're coming," he said tersely. "We need to move. Now." They ran northward, away from the trading post and the river, Isaiah leading them along game trails too narrow for horses. Behind them, they could hear men shouting and dogs beginning to bark as a search party formed. "Did you see who took you?" Isaiah asked Sarah as they paused briefly for her to drink from the canteen. "Men, I didn't know," she replied, her voice steadier now. "But they talked about their employer being particular about my condition." "Caldwell," Elizabeth spat. "Maybe," Isaiah said thoughtfully, "but something doesn't fit. This was too crude for Caldwell's usual methods." They pushed on, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as they navigated the dense forest. By late afternoon, they had reached the northern boundary of Willow Creek, approaching from the east to avoid being seen from the main road. As they emerged from the tree line, they saw a carriage waiting in front of the house, an expensive black lacquer carriage with 4 matched thoroughbreds. "Caldwell," Elizabeth hissed, pulling Sarah back into the cover of the trees. Isaiah studied the scene. "Your mother and Catherine are inside. No signs of distress." He turned to Elizabeth. "Take Sarah around to the back entrance. I'll approach from the front, see what's happening." Elizabeth nodded, her earlier resistance to Isaiah's authority completely abandoned in the face of their shared ordeal. "Be careful," she said quietly. Inside the house, Eleanor Blackwood sat across from Victor Caldwell in the parlor, Catherine standing rigidly behind her mother's chair. On the table between them lay Judge Montgomery's writ, which Eleanor had presented upon Caldwell's unexpected arrival. "A temporary inconvenience," Caldwell was saying, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "The judge has overstepped his authority." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied calmly, "but it will take time to resolve. Time during which my daughter will have been found and her kidnappers identified." Caldwell's smile tightened fractionally. "Kidnappers? My dear Eleanor, children often run away when upset. I'm sure Sarah will return once she's had her adventure." The sound of the front door opening interrupted their conversation. All heads turned as Isaiah entered the parlor, his clothes still damp from the river, blood staining his sleeve, and James Blackwood's revolver visible in his belt. Caldwell's eyes widened momentarily before his composure returned. "Well," he said silkily, "this is unexpected. Your man seems to have had quite the day." "Indeed," Eleanor replied, rising to her feet as Elizabeth and Sarah slipped in through the back of the house, appearing in the doorway behind Caldwell. "As have my daughters." Caldwell turned, his face freezing as he saw Sarah, barefoot, her nightgown torn and dirty, rope burns visible on her wrists. For once, the man seemed genuinely shocked. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he murmured, almost to himself. "What wasn't?" Eleanor demanded. "The kidnapping of my child? Or her rescue?" Caldwell's eyes darted between Sarah, Isaiah with his visible weapon, and the writ on the table. For the first time since James Blackwood's death, Eleanor saw uncertainty in the man's expression. "I think," Eleanor continued, her voice like steel, "that you should leave now, Victor. Judge Montgomery is expecting us, and Sarah has quite the story to tell him." Caldwell stood slowly. "This isn't over, Eleanor." "No," she agreed. "But it has changed. You miscalculated." As Caldwell's carriage pulled away, the Blackwood family gathered in the parlor, Sarah wrapped in a clean blanket, sipping sweet tea that Catherine had prepared. Isaiah stood by the window watching until Caldwell's carriage disappeared down the road. "He seemed surprised," Isaiah said finally, "genuinely surprised to see Miss Sarah in that condition." "You don't think he ordered the kidnapping?" Eleanor asked. Isaiah shook his head slowly. "I think someone wanted us to believe that. Someone who benefits from turning Caldwell against you even more than he already was." But who? Catherine wondered. Elizabeth, who had been unusually quiet since their return, spoke up. Someone who wants both our land and Caldwell's. Someone playing a longer game. The implications of this hung heavy in the room. If not Caldwell, then who? And what would they try next? As twilight settled over Willow Creek, Eleanor made a decision. Tomorrow we go to Judge Montgomery together. All of us. She looked at Isaiah. It's time to formalize your position here. Not as a former slave, not as a hired man, but as James's appointed steward. The judge will witness the papers. Isaiah's expression remained carefully neutral, but he nodded once, accepting this new role, and the new dangers it would bring. Outside, in the gathering darkness, a figure watched the house from the edge of the property. The day's events hadn't gone as planned, but there would be other opportunities. Willow Creek's rich soil held secrets worth killing for, and the game was far from over. The following morning dawned clear and bright, belying the tension that stretched across Willow Creek like a taut wire. Eleanor rose early, having barely slept. The events of the previous day had left her both relieved and deeply unsettled. Sarah was safe, but the realization that Caldwell might not be their only enemy had opened a new dimension of uncertainty. She found Isaiah already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, studying a worn map of the county. He stood when she entered, a habit ingrained by years of servitude that persisted despite his changed status. "You should rest," Eleanor said, pouring herself coffee from the pot he had prepared. "Yesterday took a toll on all of us." "I'll rest when we understand what's happening," Isaiah replied, his voice low to avoid waking the girls who still slept upstairs. He gestured to the map. "I've been thinking about Miss Elizabeth's theory, that someone wants both your land and Caldwell's." Eleanor joined him at the table, studying the map. Willow Creek was marked in faded ink, its boundaries clearly defined. To the west lay Caldwell's much larger estate, and to the east the Miller property, recently acquired by Caldwell through questionable means. The northern border abutted lands owned by the railroad, while the southern edge ran along the river. "The only person who would benefit from owning all this land is the railroad," Eleanor mused, tracing the northern boundary with her finger. "They've been buying up properties for their new spur line." Isaiah nodded. "And who sits on the railroad board?" "Judge Adams," Eleanor replied, naming Montgomery's rival on the bench, "and Harrison Fletcher." The latter was a name well known in the county, a northern investor who had arrived after the war, buying distressed properties and building a small empire. "Fletcher was in town yesterday," Isaiah said. "I saw his carriage outside the bank when I was checking on the Miller's Crossing rumors." A piece clicked into place in Eleanor's mind. "Fletcher tried to buy Willow Creek from James 2 years ago, offered a fair price, but James refused, said Fletcher would destroy the land with his methods. And now Fletcher sits on the railroad board that needs this exact stretch of land," Isaiah concluded. "A man like that doesn't take rejection well." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Sarah appeared in the doorway, looking small in her borrowed nightgown, her wrists bandaged where the ropes had cut into them. Despite the ordeal, her eyes were clear and alert. "I remember something," she said without preamble. "The men who took me, one of them mentioned a northern gentleman who would be displeased if I was harmed. I thought they meant Caldwell, but—" "Fletcher," Eleanor and Isaiah said in unison. Sarah nodded. They were careful not to use names, but one of them slipped and mentioned something about Fletcher's railroad plans. Isaiah folded the map carefully. "We need to tell Judge Montgomery. This changes things." "It makes them more dangerous," Eleanor agreed. "Fletcher has more resources than Caldwell, and fewer local ties to constrain him." By mid-morning, the Blackwood carriage was ready for the journey to town. Isaiah drove, with Eleanor, Elizabeth, and Sarah inside. Catherine remained at Willow Creek, armed with James's shotgun and instructions to bar the doors. The town of Oak Ridge presented its usual placid face as they arrived. Storekeepers sweeping their boardwalks, ladies in morning dresses exchanging gossip outside the milliner's shop, men gathered at the tobacco shop discussing crop prices. Yet Eleanor felt the undercurrent of tension as heads turned to watch their carriage pass. News traveled fast in small communities, and by now everyone would know that Sarah Blackwood had disappeared and returned, and that Isaiah, a former slave, had been instrumental in her recovery. The social implications alone would fuel gossip for weeks. Judge Montgomery received them in his chambers, his expression grave as he listened to their account of the kidnapping and rescue. He paid particular attention to Sarah's mention of Fletcher's name. "This is troubling," the judge said when they had finished. "Fletcher has powerful friends, both here and in the North. Accusing him of orchestrating a kidnapping is no small matter." "We're not asking you to accuse him publicly," Eleanor clarified. "Not yet. But we need protection, legal protection that goes beyond the temporary writ you provided." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "I've been reviewing James's will and the estate papers. There's something interesting there." He pulled a document from his desk. James amended his will 6 months before his death, adding a specific clause regarding Isaiah. Isaiah straightened in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "He named you as steward of Willow Creek," the judge continued, "with authority to manage the property in the event of his death until his youngest daughter reaches the age of 21. It's an unusual arrangement, but legally sound. James had it witnessed by 2 Northern officers stationed here during Reconstruction, men beyond local influence." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward her late husband. Even in death, James was protecting them, using the very Northern occupation that had humiliated the South to shield his family. "With this document properly filed," the judge explained, "Isaiah has legal standing to represent Willow Creek's interests, not as a former slave, not as a hired man, but as appointed steward with fiduciary responsibility. It won't stop Fletcher or Caldwell entirely, but it complicates their plans significantly." "File it," Eleanor said firmly. "Today." The judge nodded, then turned to Sarah. "Now, young lady, I need your formal statement about what happened. Every detail you can remember." While Sarah recounted her ordeal to the judge's clerk, Eleanor and Isaiah stepped outside to speak privately. "James never told me about naming you steward," she said quietly. "He never told me either," Isaiah replied, "though he hinted at something the night before he died. Said he'd made arrangements to ensure you wouldn't be at the mercy of men like Caldwell." Eleanor studied Isaiah's face, the face of a man who had been part of their household since before her marriage, who had known her children from birth, yet whom she had been conditioned to see as property rather than person. How much had she missed by viewing him through that distorted lens? "Why did you stay?" she asked suddenly. "After emancipation, after the war, you could have gone north, started a new life." Isaiah was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the street where white men walked freely while colored men stepped aside to let them pass, a dance of deference as old as the town itself. "I stayed because this is my home, too," he finally said. "Not the way it's yours, but I've worked this land since I was a boy. I know every creek and hollow, every field and fence post. James understood that. He offered me wages to stay, treated me as a man when others wouldn't." He paused, and I made a promise to him. "To protect us," Eleanor said softly. Isaiah nodded. He knew what was coming. Not the details, but the shape of it. Men like Caldwell and Fletcher, circling like vultures, waiting for their chance. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Victor Caldwell himself, striding purposefully toward the courthouse. He stopped short when he saw them, his usual smooth confidence replaced by visible agitation. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said stiffly, "I was just coming to speak with Judge Montgomery." "About what, Mr. Caldwell?" Eleanor asked coolly. Caldwell's eyes darted to Isaiah, then back to Eleanor. About a mutual problem. Fletcher. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware you considered him a problem. Aren't you both on the bank board? Business associations don't equal friendship, Caldwell replied. Fletcher has been working against me for months. I've only just discovered the extent of it. He lowered his voice. He's been buying my debts from northern banks, positioning himself to force me into bankruptcy. Isaiah and Eleanor exchanged glances. This was unexpected. Why tell us this? Isaiah asked, speaking directly to Caldwell for the first time. Caldwell's jaw tightened at being addressed by Isaiah, but he answered nonetheless. Because Fletcher wants both our properties, and he's willing to go to extraordinary lengths to get them. I didn't order your daughter's kidnapping, Mrs. Blackwood, but I believe Fletcher did, intending to implicate me. Before Eleanor could respond, the courthouse door opened and Judge Montgomery emerged with Sarah and Elizabeth. The judge's eyes narrowed at the sight of Caldwell. "Victor," he said coldly, "what brings you here?" "The same thing that brought Mrs. Blackwood, I imagine," Caldwell replied. "Fletcher's machinations." The judge looked skeptical but gestured for them all to return to his chambers. Inside, Caldwell laid out his case, presenting documents showing how Fletcher had systematically acquired Caldwell's debts from various banks, consolidating them under his control. "He's positioned to call in everything at once," Caldwell explained. "It would ruin me. And once he has my property, Willow Creek would be next. It's the missing piece he needs for the railroad's planned route." "Why should we believe you?" Elizabeth asked, speaking up for the first time. "After everything you've done." Caldwell had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I've been aggressive in my business dealings. I wanted Willow Creek, yes, I still do, but I would never harm a child to get it." He turned to Sarah. "I am truly sorry for what happened to you, Miss Sarah. Whatever our differences, that should never have occurred." Sarah studied him with a directness that made him shift in his seat. "I believe you didn't order it," she said finally. "The men who took me seemed afraid of their employer in a way they wouldn't be of you." "Fletcher has a reputation," Caldwell acknowledged. "His methods during the war were efficient but brutal." Judge Montgomery leaned back in his chair. "So, we have Fletcher positioning himself against both of you, potentially using criminal means to accelerate his plans. The question is, what do we do about it?" "We need proof," Isaiah said. "Something that ties Fletcher directly to the kidnapping." "The men at Miller's Crossing," Elizabeth suggested. "If we could get one of them to testify." Caldwell shook his head. "Fletcher's too careful for that. Those men are probably already gone, paid off, or worse." "Then we need to find his paper trail," Eleanor said. "Fletcher is a businessman first. He documents everything." "His office," Caldwell mused. "He keeps his most sensitive documents there rather than the bank. Says he doesn't trust the local staff." A plan began to form. An unlikely alliance between the Blackwoods and their former adversary, united against a common enemy. By the time they left the judge's chambers, the sun was high overhead, casting short shadows on the courthouse steps. As they prepared to return to Willow Creek, a messenger boy ran up to Isaiah, handing him a folded note before dashing away. Isaiah opened it, his expression darkening as he read. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "From Catherine," Isaiah replied, passing her the note. "Someone tried to break into the house while we were gone. She fired a warning shot and they fled, but we need to get back," Eleanor said urgently. "Now." As their carriage hurried toward Willow Creek, they were unaware of being observed from the window of the Grand Hotel across the square. Harrison Fletcher lowered his spyglass, a thin smile playing across his aristocratic features. "Interesting," he murmured to his companion, a hard-faced man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit. "It seems Caldwell has decided to join forces with the widow." "Problem?" the man asked. Fletcher shook his head. "Merely a complication. Accelerate our timetable. I want those properties secured by the end of the month, whatever it takes." "The girl survived," the man pointed out. "She can identify Johnson and Peters." "Then ensure Johnson and Peters don't survive to be identified," Fletcher replied coldly. "This railroad will be built on schedule, with or without the cooperation of our Southern friends." The man nodded and left the room, while Fletcher returned his attention to the departing carriage. The Blackwood woman had proven more resilient than expected, and Caldwell more pragmatic. Together with that former slave, they might prove troublesome. But Fletcher had not built his fortune by allowing troublesome obstacles to stand in his way. If legal means failed, there were always alternatives. Alternatives that had served him well during the war, when acquiring Southern properties for the Union cause had required a certain moral flexibility. The railroad would go through as planned, and if a few more Southern families were ruined in the process, well, that was simply the price of progress.